Hi there, I'm Dr. Joel Korecko. I'm Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Northwest Seminary and College, and I'm a biblical scholar. This is my channel where we talk about various things related to my academic discipline, which is biblical studies. And today I want to talk about an issue that I've kind of seen online for a while, and I've heard it with colleagues and at academic conferences, and I've seen literature on this, and it relates to the issue of child sacrifice in the Old Testament. And now, this particular perspective takes a couple of texts from the Old Testament, a few texts, but today we're going to deal with two. And it postulates from a critical perspective. And here, I mean by critical, I mean this is a perspective that's not a faith-based perspective. It's not assuming that biblical text is inspired or coherent. It could be contradictory. It could have various editorial layers, all these kinds of things. So, from that perspective, that there are multiple texts that refer to the God of Israel, Yahweh, um, commanding child sacrifice. So the idea is that in an earlier time in Israelite history, that some texts give a window into, they would say that Yahweh actually commanded child sacrifice. And then later on, there are editorial updates or different authors who then condemn that practice. And so there's different strands of Israelite religion within the biblical text. That's the claim. And there are a few texts that they highlight are uh, they highlight to be kind of obvious in this regard, or the most clear examples. And so I know some people might not agree with critical methodology. I try to approach everything from a data-driven perspective. What does the text say, and what grounds do we have to make those claims? And so today I will be trying to do that again. And I want to engage two of these texts that I see often talked about in this regard. And I want to give my perspective on them. So I'm going to read you them now. I'm going to pull them up for you here so that you can see them. And if you've never heard this perspective before, well, uh, I would encourage you to come along with me on this and to see, do these claims hold up, or could there be a better way of framing them, framing these particular verses? And so here they are for you, and I'll start off just giving you them. So we have one here, which, oh, actually, you know what? I have to click the other button. Here you go. So this one is from Ezekiel 20, 25 to 26. And it says this, and I'll just read the English. I've given the Hebrew. I will be referring to the Hebrew as we move along, but I'll start with the English. And in turn, I gave to them rules that were not good and regulations by which they will not live. And I defiled them through their gifts in sacrificing all of the first offspring of the womb, in order that I will cause them to be stunned or rendered desolate or something like that, so that they will know that I am Yahweh. It's an interesting verse. And so the claim is that Yahweh, so this is Ezekiel speaking on behalf of God, he gave them rules that weren't good and regulations by which they will not live. And then you ask, oh, what? God gave not good rules, not good regulations? And so one perspective would say, yes, he did give not good rules. And then the next verse will describe what they are: defiling them through their gifts and sacrificing all the firstborn, the first offspring of the womb. So, in other words, he gave them rules that say you should sacrifice your firstborn offspring. That is, the claim is that is firstborn children. And so there's this perspective then that this is Ezekiel looking back on Israelite history, looking back on history where God gave them rules, or ingrained rules, or there's different ways of looking at it, brought in rules about sacrificing your firstborn children to him, so that they would actually be defiled and then eventually would go into exile. And so the claim is that Ezekiel is looking back and seeing that this did happen, that God himself gave them legislation and rules to sacrifice their children. And then, of course, Ezekiel will come in and in the book of Ezekiel and say, like, no, now, presently, and other prophets will say that, but he's then referring to the past when this was true. Okay, so that's one way of viewing this text, and what do you do with that, right? That sounds pretty plausible. So perhaps let's think about it. Let's work on it together. There's another text I did want to point you to. which is this one, Exodus 22:28. It's verse 29 in the Septuagint, so depending which version you're using. And this one says, "You will not delay the fullness of your harvest and the juice from your press. You will give me the firstborn of your sons. You will do likewise, or in this manner, for your ox and for your sheep and goats. 7 days it will be with its mother. On the 8th, you will give it to me." And so this section of Exodus is, from a critical perspective, largely regarded to be old, an ancient set of legislation, or at least this section. And the claim there is that, what Ezekiel talks about, these laws where God says you give your firstborn children in sacrifice to me, well, this could be an example of that in Exodus. And now I know there are people who will say, but Exodus has other parts about redeeming the firstborn. Yes, and so from a critical perspective, they would say those are different authors, different time periods when those are written, and this is an actually more ancient section of Exodus. And so, of course, I'm not telling you one way or the other on what to say about that, but I'm saying this is what the claim is. And so here you have, without any redemption clause or anything, the claim to sacrifice the firstborn child, firstborn son. And so again, on the face of it, on the surface, it's a possible claim, maybe even plausible. So what do we do with that? Is that true? Are there other ways to think about that? And so I've spent some time on this. And I don't want to say that people who hold a different perspective aren't trying to do the best with the text that they can. I think that's true, and there are different ways and perspectives at coming at texts, and I understand why people land where they land. I don't think that this child sacrifice interpretation is the best interpretation of these texts. And so I actually want to walk through that. And so if you're interested in this, and if you've heard this online, let's say, then come with me. We're gonna do a deep dive here. So don't think this is going to be surface level. It's not. We're going to walk through this, and hopefully it will make more sense to you as we move along. And you'll see why I don't find this particularly convincing based on the data of the text. Um, Everyone has biases. I have my own biases. You have biases. You might be someone who doesn't like the Bible, and maybe you're someone who is predisposed, who wants to see kind of contradictions or moral quandaries. That might be possible. I am a Christian, and so maybe I have biases that I'm going to hold on to. The goal in scholarship is to try your best to take those and put them to the side and deal with the data in front of you, and to let that data then influence your biases. And so I try to do that as much as I can as a scholar. And I'm trying to do that here. So if I really did think that this went the other way, I would have to then think about, conceptualize how that might work. But I just don't think it makes sense in the end. And so we're going to now get into that. So grab a coffee, whatever you want to do. If you're listening to this in a podcast or something like that, or with headphones, let's move through this text, and we'll work on it together. Okay. So we're going to start with Ezekiel here, and we'll go from there. How do we even start dealing with this issue? I mean, there are a few things to talk about, and we're going to do a lot of background right now to this verse. Because if you just come to this verse by itself, I think you're going to have problems. Because you can kind of read a verse any way you want. Now, it's not completely true, but you have to think about context. It's always about context, right? And so in Ezekiel 20, there's something specific going on here. And if you just read the verse by itself, you might come up with a child sacrifice interpretation. And I know that this, I don't want to unfairly characterize people, because these people also read the broader context. But I want to back up, and I want to take a look at something here. What is going on in Ezekiel 20? There's something bigger here, and that is that there is a Pentateuchal, I'm going to use that Pentateuchal narrative structure when it comes to chapter 20. There's this narrative that we're going to see Ezekiel engaging in that follows the general beats of what we see in the narrative of the Pentateuch. or at least Sinai. It's kind of Sinai story. And I'm going to show you that, and that's actually going to influence the way in which we interpret this passage. It's actually very, very important for understanding this particular passage. Okay, so here's the verse now in front of us. Let's now walk back and talk about this narrative that Ezekiel is establishing in chapter 20, because it's going to help us here. So I've given you now the text, or just a clip from Daniel Block in his 1997 commentary. And it's a little bit hard to read here, so please don't think you need to necessarily read it all. That's not the point. What I want to point out is that it is largely agreed in Ezekiel scholarship that Ezekiel in chapter 20 is going to be giving you a history of Israel. It's not always clear on the surface, but if you read it closely, there's a history going on. And so Daniel Block, in his excellent commentary, by no means a evangelical or something like that, or I should say someone who's going to just try and cherry pick and read the text in a positive light or anything like that. So this commentary, it's an excellent commentary, notes something, that there are different panels, different segments of story going on in chapter 20. And so there's going to be panel 1, Israel and Egypt. There's going to be panel 2, the first desert generation. And there's going to be panel 3, the second desert generation. And Ezekiel is going to use motifs as well in his elaboration of this story. And so this is just here. I'm giving you the second page because I couldn't fit it all on one slide. So you've got panel 1, 2, and 3, and then you've got panel 2 and 3. And these are just 2 pages of Block's commentary. What you need to know is that this kind of structuring is relatively agreed upon. Now, whether it's 3 panels or more, that's not 100% clear or agreed upon. But I'll give you another scholar here. So Patton says the clearest reference to the Exodus in the book of Ezekiel occur in chapter 20. The text clearly shows familiarity with the Exodus tradition, sojourn in Egypt, verses 5 to 8, deliverance by the Lord, 9 and 10, 2 generations in the wilderness, 10 to 25, the giving of the law in the wilderness, 11 to 13, 25 to 26, and entry into the land, 28. That's from his article, I Myself. And I can put a bibliography in the text, or in the thing below the video, whatever you would call that. So the outline I'm going to follow is from Block, which you have here on the screen. Block himself says there's considerable debate over the structuring of Exodus 20, particularly as it concerns verses 5 to 31, if it should be 3, 4, or 5 sections. However, I'm going to take Block's approach here, and I'm actually going to take the approach of an article from almost 20 years ago by Han and Bergsma. And so what I'm developing here now with you is going to be a modified version of that argument from Han and Bergsma. And I'll get into what that argument is as we go. But I think it's going to make sense as we move forward. So they agree with Block that there are 3 panels here. And they identify a few things that you should note in each of the panels, which kind of help distinguish that there are 3 panels going on, and they're relying on Block as well. So you're going to find at least 5. There's 5 elements. There's a divine oath, so I've given you in red there. There is a statement of I am the Lord or Yahweh. I've given that to you in purple. There's a revolt by Israel or rebellion, and I've given that to you in green. A threat of divine wrath or making an end, that's in blue. And then a divine restraint, I'll give that in orange. And each of these panels are going to be different segments of this kind of Sinai story that we find also in the Pentateuch. I'm not claiming one way or the other whether Ezekiel was relying on the form of the Pentateuch that we have now, but that's actually besides the point here. So it seems as though he's well aware of a Sinai tradition that follows the beats of what we see in the Pentateuch. This is really going to help us. So I want to read with you the text, and then I want you just to follow with me. So I understand we're doing things in detail here, but this is actually very important. So hopefully this can be kind of a definitive analysis of this text for you. So just to be clear, the three panels correspond to the three stages of Israel's exodus and wilderness wanderings. The first panel, what we're looking at here, concerns God's dealings with Israel and Egypt. The second panel is verses 10 to 17 with the first generation in the wilderness and the Sinai event. And the third panel, 18 to 26, with the second generation in the wilderness. And Hahn and Bergsma are going to propose that third panel is referencing the Deuteronomic giving of the law, when Moses gives the law in the plains of Moab, in what we see in Deuteronomy. And so I was citing there from Hahn and Bergsma's article from page 203. Again, I'll give you the bibliographic data in the blurb below the video. So let's read this, and we'll quickly go through it. And you must say to them, thus says the Lord Yahweh, on the day of my choosing Israel, I swore to the offspring of the house of Jacob, and I made myself known to them in the land of Egypt, and I swore to them, saying, I am Yahweh, your God. On that day I swore to them to bring them out of the land of Egypt, the land that I had searched out for them, flowing with milk and honey. It is the most beautiful of all the lands. Then I said to them, let each one throw away the detestable things out of his eyes, and you must not make yourselves unclean with the idols of Egypt. I am Yahweh, your God. But they rebelled against me. There's the green. And they were not willing to listen to me. Each one did not throw away the detestable things of their eyes, and they did not abandon the idols of Egypt. And I decided to pour out my rage on them, to fully vent my anger against them. There's the threat in the midst of the land of Egypt. So again, in Egypt. Notice this. They're in Egypt. Follow the narrative. But I acted for the sake of my name, to keep it from being profaned before the eyes of the nations among whom they had lived, where I made known to them before their eyes, to bring them out from the land of Egypt. So notice you've got this fivefold repetition of the patterns, which I've given you in colors here, but also note they are in Egypt. Follow the narrative, okay? So we'll continue now from here. Hopefully that's clear that they are in Egypt. And I'm going to continue with the next panel that shows them coming out of Egypt, and this is up until the golden calf. So it's not the full second panel just yet. We're going to get there in a second. But I wanted to give you this text and point out a couple things as well. So how do we know this is them up until the golden calf? I'm going to show you why. Because I brought them out of the land of Egypt, and I brought them to the desert. So, out of Egypt into the desert. And I gave them, please pay attention now, because this is really, really important. I gave them my statutes, the Hebrew word is hukot, and my regulations, mishpatim, I made known to them, which if a person does them, he will live by them. What I just said, hukot, mishpatim, and if a person does them, he will live by them, is going to become incredibly important as we go forward, rhetorically speaking, for what Ezekiel is doing. He's using specific terms, and he's making an echo. There's intertextuality here that's going on, and I'm going to show you why. And also my Sabbaths I gave to them to be a sign between me and between them, so that they would know that I am Yahweh, the one sanctifying them. But in the desert, the house of Israel rebelled against me. They did not walk in my statutes, and they rejected my regulations, which, if a person does them, he will live by them. And they greatly profaned my Sabbaths. And I decided to pour out my rage on them in the desert to destroy them, and I acted for the sake of my name, that it not be profaned before the eyes of the nations before whom I brought them out. So notice again that we've got the purple, the I am Yahweh, rebellion in the green, threat in the blue, restraint in the orange. So it's another panel, right? There's these literary cues going on that Ezekiel's giving us that you need to pay attention to because they're actually very important. I want to point you to verse 12 to show you how we know this is going up to the golden calf. Ezekiel 20:12 talks about the Sabbaths. Also my Sabbaths I gave to them to be a sign between me and between them, so they would know that I am Yahweh, the one sanctifying them. That's actually almost a citation. It certainly is intertextual with the book of Exodus. And Yahweh spoke to Moses and said, and you speak to the Israelites, saying, surely you must keep my Sabbaths, because it is a sign, the oath, between me and between you throughout your generations, in order to know that I am Yahweh, who sanctifies you. You see what's going on there? That we've got the same language of signs, the one who sanctifies you, the Sabbaths all coming together. And so this is in the narrative of Exodus, this is right after coming out of Egypt, and this is right before the golden calf. Exodus 31:13 is the only passage with the Sabbath as a sign and the language of the one who sanctifies. So you can actually see perhaps Ezekiel looking to this narrative and going, here we go. We're now at this section where we're just about to hit rebellion. And that's going to be the golden calf. That's the big rebellion, right? On Sinai. So he's queuing you up and saying, hey, keep following with me here. We're talking about Sabbaths now. What's interesting, bit of a side note here, is that Ezekiel seems to see Sabbath violations, multiple Sabbath violations going on here. The idea of defiling the Sabbaths. That's interesting. Block in his commentary says the only recorded event in the Desert Sinai narratives relating to Sabbath violation involved the gathering of manna on the Sabbath in Exodus 16:17-30. Ezekiel's use of the plural points in another direction. That's from 633, page 633. Here's a fun fact. I have an article that I have submitted to a journal, and then also that I'm hoping will get accepted at SBL this year. It's actually, I think the decision date is today or tomorrow. And it's going to be talking about this very subject, that why does Ezekiel, or it's going to refer to this, why are there multiple Sabbath violations being referred to by Ezekiel? And I actually think there's something going on in the golden calf story in that regard. So there's something with my scholarship, and stay tuned for that. So I think that Ezekiel might actually be reading Exodus in a really specific and nuanced way, or at least these stories that have been brought to Ezekiel. Okay, take that, move that aside. That's just something interesting about my own work. And let's keep going. So we've now seen the second panel, and we're going to continue in that with the last bit here. And this is what we can see in Numbers. We can see the same idea in Numbers. So continuing, I also myself swore. So again, the swearing showing that it's one of the themes of each panel. To them in the desert, not bring them into the land that I've given them, flowing with milk and honey, the most beautiful of the lands, because they despised my judgments, mishpatim, and they did not walk in my statutes, hukot. Remember these terms, hukot, mishpatim. And my Sabbaths they profaned, for their heart was going after their idols. But my eye took pity on them by not destroying them. I did not completely destroy them in the desert. So we see, again, this repetition of the various items for each panel. And then you can see in Numbers that this is now moved on. The story's moved on to when God does swear to them in the desert to not bring them into the land. That only happens in this one place. And so if you know the narrative, then you know what's going on here. But you have to actually be following what the story Ezekiel's telling. And so he's referring now to this idea. As I'm alive, the glory of Yahweh will fill the earth. This is from Numbers 14. But all the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the desert, yet tested me these 10 times, and did not listen to my voice, they will not see the land that I swore by oath to their ancestors, and all those who despise me will not see it. So this is the point in these Sinai narratives when God says, he swears that they're not going to do it. And so this is the only place where you're going to see that. And so we can be quite sure that this is what's being referred to by Ezekiel. So this is, I think, relatively clear. I mean, we can see other people agreeing with this. So Hannenberg some agree with this on page 204, but so does Block, 633 of his commentary. And so it's not particularly debated that we're continuing in the narrative that way. So hopefully it's making sense so far. Egypt, panel 1, come out. We've got Sinai. We've got the golden calf. We've got this oath swearing that this first generation won't make it through. And now we're going to continue. We're in panel 3 now. And we can read that together in a second here. And I said to their children in the desert, you must not go in the statutes. Now notice, not hukot, hukim, of your parents. You must not keep their regulations, mishpatim, and you must not make yourself unclean with your idols. Just by the way, statutes could be, so hukot is just the feminine ending, hukim is a masculine ending, but we're going to see that that actually matters in Ezekiel because it's a rhetorical flourish that he's going to use. So verse 19, I am Yahweh, your God, so go in my statutes, hukot, so not the hukim, hukot, and keep my regulations, mishpatim, and do them. And treat my Sabbaths as holy, and they will be a sign between me and between you, that you may know that I am Yahweh, your God. But the children rebelled against me. So now we see again, we've got the rebellion theme, we've got the I am Yahweh theme. They did not walk in my statutes, hukot, and they did not observe my regulations, mishpatim, which, if a person does them, then he will live by them. We've seen this twice now. My Sabbaths they desecrated, and I decided to pour out my rage on them, to finish my anger against them in the desert. So there's the threat. But I withheld my hand, and I acted for the sake of my name, not to be profaned before the eyes of the nations, before whom I had brought them out before their eyes. There's the restraint, the theme again. What is more, I swore, here's the oath, to them in the desert to scatter, putz, that's the verb in Hebrew, we'll come back to that, among the nations, and to disperse them into the lands, because they did not do my regulations, mishpatim, and my statutes, hukot, they despised. And my Sabbaths they profaned, and their eyes were after their idols of their ancestors. And in turn I gave to them rules, hukim, that were not good, and regulations, mishpatim, by which they will not live. And I defiled them through their gifts in sacrificing all of their first offspring of the womb, in order that I will cause them to be stunned, so that I will know that I am Yahweh. So there's the verse in question, right? We've now made it all the way there. We're walking up contextually. So follow with me that we're walking through this contextually. We're going to talk a bit about what's going on here. So I'm going to give you my perspective on panel 3 here. I know there's other perspectives. For example, if we go with Block again, this idea that while in the desert, God swore to scatter his people among the nations. Neither the pre-conquest narratives nor any other texts allude to such an event, he says. This observation, combined with Ezekiel's propensity to apply the expression to scatter among the lands to the present situation, suggests that the prophet has telescoped 8 or 9 centuries of national history into one cryptic statement and retrojected it onto Israel's desert experience. So he thinks that this is kind of like a holistic approach to Israel's history being described here in panel 3. I'm going to disagree with that, and so are Han and Bergsma. So my perspective is in line with theirs on this particular bit. And by the way, I'm not only repeating Han and Bergsma's approach here, I'm actually going to give my own integrated approach where I think they've missed some things that are really important with the rhetoric of what's going on in Ezekiel. So this is Han and Bergsma, Ezekiel 20, 18 to 26. So we're looking at that in front of us here. Now explicitly speaks of the second generation in their wilderness, corresponding to the Pentateuchal narrative from Numbers 25 through the end of Deuteronomy. The rebellion of the second generation in the desert in verse 21, the children rebelled against me, would refer to the sin of Baal Peor in number 25. Some scholars have argued, somewhat implausibly, that the participants in the orgiastic cult of Baal Peor were the last aging survivors of the first generation. We follow those commentators, for example, Dozman, for whom Numbers 22:1 to 36:13 describes the second generation of Israelites on the plains of Moab. So moving out of the citation for a sec, that's really important. We are on the plains of Moab. I'll say it again. We are on the plains of Moab. In the narrative, we've spent now 29 minutes walking you through the narrative that Ezekiel's giving you from Egypt to Sinai to the wilderness to the plains of Moab. That's very important. Okay, continuing their quote. The juxtaposition of Baal Peor in Numbers 25 with the second census in Numbers 26, together with the second generation's responsibility to avenge itself on the Midianites, implies that it was the second generation rather than the first that fell into this sin. In fact, some commentators have argued that the sin of Baal Peor was the catastrophic event for the second generation, as the golden calf was for the first. Thus, the context of Ezekiel 20:23 is that of the second generation, and it is in verse 23 that clear allusions to Deuteronomic material first occur, so stuff in Deuteronomy. Verse 23 says, I swore to them in the wilderness that I would scatter them among the nations. To what could this refer? So now we're getting back to the poots that I mentioned. Ezekiel 20:23 sums up the prophet's synthetic interpretation of this Deuteronomic material. The covenant curses in Deuteronomy 27-28 state that when Israel breaks the covenant, they will be scattered. It is in this sense that Ezekiel 20:23 alludes to Deuteronomy 32:40. But how can we confirm that when Ezekiel says in 2023, I swore to them in the wilderness that I would scatter them, he refers to Deuteronomy and not just the covenant curses of the holiness code in Leviticus 26. So there's a section of Leviticus that's called the holiness code. We'll move aside from that for a second. First, although Leviticus 26 threatens dispersal in verse 33, it is only in Deuteronomy that Israel is assured by, among other things, a divine oath sung by Moses that they will be inevitably scattered. So I've cited to you from page 204, 205 from Hahn and Bergsma. Now, note that this term, poots here, it's a Deuteronomic term for scatter. So I've given it to you there. It's in verse 23. And that suggests that the curses from Deuteronomy, the oath from Deuteronomy, the song of Moses from Deuteronomy is in mind. It's using both the language of Leviticus, the holiness code with the Zerah, and then also poots from Deuteronomy. So the relation of Deuteronomy to the second generation, and particular to the apostasy of Beth Peor, is underscored by the fact that, according to the narrative of Deuteronomy, Israel has not moved from Beth Peor when Moses imposes on them the Deuteronomic laws. So hear that again. We're in the plains of Moab. That's where we are in this whole thing. He's using the language of Deuteronomy, poots of the scattering, and that's the text where we hear that it's going to happen. You're going to be scattered to the nations. There's now more we're going to get about Deuteronomy coming up, and maybe you're starting to see, maybe you've picked up what I'm going to be claiming and what Hahn and Bergsma are claiming, which is ultimately that what we're going to be dealing with is the book of Deuteronomy as the not good laws, and we're going to conceptualize that in a moment. Okay, so I want to give you one more idea here that's going to be helpful. And so if we look to, in panel 3, there's also a bunch of Deuteronomy-like language from what we actually see in Deuteronomy 12. So Hahn and Bergsma say as well, when we continue tracing the narrative of the text, temporarily setting aside the difficult issue of verse 26, which is what we're talking about, right? This is a child sacrifice. We encounter other evidence that Ezekiel has moved to speaking about the Deuteronomic code. The following sections, verses 27 to 29, clearly refer to Israel's entrance into the land. When I brought them into the land, and they saw any high hill or any leafy tree, they slaughtered their sacrifices there and presented their offensive offerings there. So these verses represent violations of the law of the central sanctuary from Deuteronomy 12. And Ezekiel alludes to this very chapter in wordplay. So upon entrance to the land, instead of seeking out the site that the Lord will choose, the Israelites sacrificed promiscuously. The contrast with Deuteronomy 12 is brought out by the repetition of the word there, and I put it in bold here. There's this constant there, 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 there. In Deuteronomy 12, like you need to go there to the central cult. It's this emphatic thing going on there. And you see here, he's drawing that out. The there, 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 there. They went and sacrificed elsewhere. Sacrifice is going to become important as we move forward as well. Okay, so he's referring to Deuteronomy, I think. I think there are lots of clues here, not only the narrative, but the language, what's coming up. Just following the verses in question. I'm trying to really nail this home, or hit this home, because if you don't see the narrative, you can interpret this verse in a different way. But I don't find it compelling because of the narrative that's being led up and the language that's being drawn on. So this is the point I'm trying to make. If you have not picked up on it, we can see Ezekiel moving through the Egypt, Sinai, and second generation narratives. We see Ezekiel get to Deuteronomy and the plains of Moab in the story he's telling in chapter 20. Take this now and move forward with me. in our interpretation. So if we return to this verse, I want to now talk a bit about intertextuality with Leviticus. So Ezekiel, I think, is relying on Pentateuchal traditions, especially Leviticus. So what Ezekiel is a priest. Ezekiel cares a lot about Levitical standards, things within the book of Leviticus, I should say, that we see there now represented. And this is actually really important when we get into this verse about giving not good rules and regulations. Why are they not good? Well, if Ezekiel cares a lot about Leviticus, it's going to become apparent. So I'm just going to read to you a couple quotes here. This is from a 2022 article by Gerard called A Legal Illusion. He says, the undeniable similarities between the book of Ezekiel and the priestly material have been consistently acknowledged. So priestly material, for the sake of what we're doing here, I'm just going to say some of the stuff in Leviticus, with particular attention to its notable affinity to H, which is Leviticus 17 to 26. These are different ways of categorizing these texts. The shared locutions and vocabulary between Ezekiel and H are thought to be the result of literary dependence between the two texts. So he's saying stuff in Leviticus, there's dependence going on here in Ezekiel. Of course, the question is, which way does it go? I'm not going to get into that right now. All I'm saying is there is reference to the stuff we find in Leviticus. Now from the Oxford Handbook on Ezekiel from Calendar 2020. Given the presentation of Ezekiel as a priest, it comes as no surprise that the book reflects priestly traditions. Ezekiel's closest perceived literary affinities are found within the Holiness Code, Leviticus 17 to 26. Ezekiel is relying on Leviticus, I think, what we see in there, the laws we see in there. Of course, now there is the question of, well, is it which came first? In critical scholarship, I should say, which came first? Levitical stuff, Ezekiel, how do these traditions relate? I'm only going to say this because this is from this recent, I believe this is from the Oxford Handbook. Oh, I didn't put the citation there, did I? This is from 2017, I believe. The challenges in sorting out the literary development of Ezekiel, the Pentateuchal sources, and the Deuteronomic tradition have proven formidable. The fact that scholars who focus on Pentateuchal traditions accord chronological priority to Ezekiel, while scholars whose focus is Ezekiel argue for the reverse, testifies to the extent of the problem. That's from Pullman, Ezekiel, New Directions, and Current Debates from 2017, page 11. So the point that the person's making, please don't check out, is that which came first, Pentateuch, Ezekiel, Pentateuch, what's the state of reliance? They say, Pentateuchal scholars will say, hey, Ezekiel gets priority, whereas Ezekiel scholars will say, oh, hey, that the Pentateuch is being relied on. There's no agreement here, okay? I'm just going to back off from that from now and say that we see Ezekiel using this content we find from Leviticus. And you say, okay, well, how do you, are you sure, Joel? Show me. Okay. I'm just going to briefly give you this here. These are just laws in Ezekiel and the Pentateuch where we see overlap. Pretty overwhelming, I understand, but just take a look. You can see it's all over the place. We've got stuff from Deuteronomy, we've got stuff from Leviticus, we've got stuff from Deuteronomy and Leviticus. So these texts are being engaged with by Ezekiel all over the place. This is not up for debate. Similarly, more here. This is all from the Oxford Handbook on Ezekiel from 2020. This is not a This is not a scholarly, a curated to a scholarly standard. By the way, if they say that, this is just giving you examples. Each one could be contested on its own. So we can see Ezekiel is relying on these, or is engaged with these texts. I'm going to continue now and give you another one. This is from Gerard, Legal Illusion, and he's citing Michael Lyons, and noting, now note here, we've now moved to chapter 20. Ezekiel 20, and look at this, engaging with what we've heard, these chapters of Leviticus, these very specific chapters. You've got, I've just given you the citations here. I'm not going to read them out, but I'm showing you this because I want you to see that what's going on is a debate about law in chapter 20 of Ezekiel. So here again, look, Ezekiel 20 is making references to the Levitical legal code at near the end of the book, often called H. Okay. What do we do with this? How does this help us? It is incredibly important because I've been trying to help you see something as we've moved here, that we're at a certain point in the narrative, Deuteronomy or the plains of Moab. Ezekiel's caring very much about Levitical standards, and now we get to the verse in question. And so you see it there at the bottom. And now I want to show you what's really important about the rhetoric of Ezekiel here. There's a rhetorical device and intertextuality that's going on here. And if you miss this, I think a lot of people miss this. And that's part of the reason why they don't get this, what's going on, and maybe get different interpretations. Ezekiel is going to cite Leviticus, a specific verse in Leviticus, repeatedly as a rhetorical device. If you have to catch this, note the verse at the top here, Leviticus 18:5. You shall therefore keep my statutes, hukot, and my rules, mishpatim, by which, if a person does them, he shall live by them. I am the Lord. Now, that's Leviticus. That verse is only there in Leviticus. One verse. Now go to Ezekiel. I gave them my statutes, hukot, and I made known to them my rules, mishpatim. So this is the hukot and the mishpatim of Leviticus 18:5, by which, if a person does them, he shall live. Note, he is citing Leviticus 18:5. This is intertextuality. He's saying, by the way, I gave you Leviticus. I gave you hukot, mishpatim, that if you do them, you live by them. That's Ezekiel 20:11. He does it again 2 verses later. They did not walk in my hukot, but rejected my mishpatim, by which if a person does them, he shall live. Again, repeating the same line. Again, in verse 21, they did not walk in my statutes, hukot, were not careful to obey my mishpatim, rules, by which if a person does them, he shall live. Again, citing Leviticus 18:5. Then he's going to get to verses 25 and 26. And here's the important part. He's going to turn it on its head. Okay? He's going to cite Leviticus again, but turn it on its head. This is the big climax of the argument, okay? What is he doing? In verse 25, this is what he says. And in turn, I gave them, notice again, reference back to 2011, the first time I gave them statutes, and you're expecting the hukot. God gives the hukot, just like Leviticus. But instead, no, it's the hukim. He changes it. It's no longer the pure Levitical hukot. Leviticus has the hukot, the prime laws, the chef's kiss laws. These are the best laws according to Ezekiel. He loves Leviticus, but he says, God gave them hukim that were not good, and mishpatim by which they will not live. Notice he flipped the Levitical statement, the statement from Leviticus 18:5. It's not that they will live by now, by which they will not live. You see what's going on? He's turning it on its head. He's saying, I gave you something that's not Leviticus. And so I'm going to give you my paraphrase here that I actually really like. And I in turn gave to them statutes, hukim, that were not Leviticus, and rules, mishpatim, which were not Leviticus. That's essentially what he's saying here. He's leading you up here saying, I had these pure Sinaitic laws, Levitical laws, as a priest that I loved, and I gave you then something that's not them. Do you see how the rhetoric here leads you up to that? And again, because we're on the plains of Moab, and we've got this Deuteronomic language coming in, what is he giving them in the story? He's giving them Deuteronomy. That's what's going on here. And now you might wonder, how is Deuteronomy not good? Well, we'll get into that in a second. But that's where he's been leading this whole time. I'm not the only one who's noticed that Leviticus 18:5 is cited here, but the rhetoric of it is not drawn out in a lot of the literature. Actually, I don't see it really in much of the literature drawn out. So the laws that are not Leviticus, well, I mean, you could probably say better that these are laws that are not Sinaitic laws in the story when the laws were given on Sinai, like that whole legal thing. So that would include Exodus. But it says that God gave these laws. This is a law-giving event now. So again, what is it? I could get into, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip by how do we know this is a citation. It does fit Tuman's standards of citation that we find, but I'm not going to get into that at the moment. So I've kind of already alluded to why does Ezekiel in verse 25 switch from the feminine hukot to the masculine hukim. Lots of people have noted this, that the switch. The question is, what does it mean? What's the rhetorical function of it? Some would say that it's these are self-made rulings. For example, the Word Biblical Commentary by Allen thinks that. I don't think that's what's going on here. I know there's a parallel to an earlier text where that could be claimed. We'll talk about that in a minute. Others have argued that 2025, they're referring, the hukim refer to decrees and then judgments. And so that's recently in 2022, Gill, and then he follows Friebel in that. And I've seen people talk about Friebel. We'll talk a bit about that as we get to some considerations against this argument that I'm giving you. I don't think that Friebel's argument makes sense. I don't think it's the best explanation of the data. I think the intertextual link is with Leviticus 18:5. That text has the feminine, listen here, hukot and mishpatim. Leviticus 18:5. This is what we're seeing here. Leviticus, outside of one time in chapter 26, does not pair hukim and mishpatim. But even in chapter 26, if there's this triad, it's with torot as well. So it's not this pairing of hukot, mishpatim. The hukot, mishpatim, that's the language of Leviticus. The statutes and the commands, or the regulations. In contrast, now here, this is actually very important. Deuteronomy, I think I actually have a slide for you here because it's so important. Deuteronomy is the place where we consistently find the pairs of the masculine hukim with mishpatim. I'm going to say that again. Deuteronomy is the place where we consistently find the pairs masculine hukim and mishpatim. In fact, hukim and mishpatim occur as the first thing in the introduction to the Deuteronomic law in chapter 4. Here it is for you on the screen. This is immediately after the preamble about where they were in Israel's history in the book of Deuteronomy. Hukim and mishpatim set off the Deuteronomic law. This is a signal to the readers that we are dealing with Deuteronomy in comparison with Leviticus. Do you see what I'm saying here? Why did it go from hukot to hukim? Because the hukim and the mishpatim is how Deuteronomy refers to its own laws. I'm being pretty dogmatic and loud and vocal here because this is so important. This is a signal that we're talking about Deuteronomy. The Hukim and the Mishpatim, that's Deuteronomy's language. So he's saying, I gave them rules, Hukim, and regulations that were Deuteronomy. Things that weren't Leviticus, but were Deuteronomy. Now, I know that in Ezekiel 20:18, there's a reference to Hukim and Mishpatim, where it says that your ancestors gave you Hukim and Mishpatim. I think that, so you could make a claim, a counterclaim, oh, well, what about that? That's not referring to Deuteronomy. No, it's not. I think the function of Hukim and Mishpatim is saying this is less than. These are laws that are less than. They're not the hukot of Leviticus. They are a lower level of law. Nothing to Ezekiel is like the beautiful laws of Leviticus as a priest. So the Hukim are a downgrade. And so the ancestors gave laws which were a downgrade or were not like the Hukot of Leviticus. And here we have Deuteronomy being similarly laws which were not on the level of Leviticus. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Okay, let's continue, and now I think it's gonna make a lot more sense to you. Let's actually get to this law now, finally, to this verse. So I hope I've made clear that when it says I gave them rules and regulations by which they will not live, he's saying I gave on the plains of Moab them Hukim and Mishpatim, that is, I gave them Deuteronomy's prescriptions. And these, Ezekiel thinks, are not as good as Leviticus. He doesn't say they're evil. He actually just says that they're not good. They're not really the best. And why would Deuteronomy not be considered the best? And this actually becomes clear now. So we're going to get into this right now. So again, one way to interpret the not good laws was, as we've been talking about, child sacrifice. You'll find this in guys like Durrell from, I believe, 2017, maybe 2018. I have a hard time saying her name. Stavrakopulu. I think that's right. I don't know if I got that right. I even looked it up, and I think that's right. So you've got her and her work from the early 2000s. There are many commentaries and articles that do think that this verse refers to child sacrifice. I'm not saying I'm giving you a consensus position. I only like consensus as a tool. It is not a right. Once we start resting on the laurels of consensus, why are we doing what we're doing as scholars? And so, sure, there are a lot of people who hold the interpretation of child sacrifice here. I am showing you why I don't think this is the case. So the one way, again, that this could be viewed is that God gives them these child sacrifice laws, and with one possible reason that God aimed to enable to execute the exile in the future. God implanted wrong customs and manners that would continue in following generations until the time of the exile. By doing that, so he ensured that the people who would suffer the exile in the future, they would deserve it as much as their parents did. So that's just citing from Kugler, The Cruel Theology from 2017, page 54. This perspective of child sacrifice. But again, Ezekiel's a priest. The not good laws, I think, are not referring to child sacrifice, but referring to Deuteronomy. So then how does this firstborn thing work, right? What's going on here? And so now we're moving into Deuteronomy and the idea of firstborn. Before we do, I would remind you again, there are two places where we see God giving laws in the story that Ezekiel's given. One was Sinai, and now God gives again. And so I think it's setting up, again, Deuteronomy. So what's wrong with Deuteronomy? You might be asking, Joel, get to the point. What's wrong with Deuteronomy? Okay, There are some things wrong with Deuteronomy in this sense. Deuteronomy changes provisions for firstborn animals away from what's prescribed in Leviticus in ways that would defile Israel, especially when it comes to non-consecrated animals' blood allowed to be poured out on the ground like water, and these animals not being brought to the temple. There is a lower standard, a concession that Ezekiel acknowledges. Yahweh lowered the standard and stunned them by it. So what I'm trying to say here is that there are changes to Levitical law that we find in Leviticus in the book of Deuteronomy. It is clear that Ezekiel preferred the laws in Leviticus over Deuteronomy. Maybe you're having a hard time with this because you're going, wait, how can you have laws that contradict each other in the Bible? I have no problem with that because I don't think that's how they conceptualized law in the ancient world. And I also think that law was malleable in that sense. So Deuteronomy is offering concessions to what we find in Leviticus, and people just thought, oh yes, of course, like we need to consider new concessions, and there are new situations that arise where we're going to change the way that we view certain things to make it fit with the current way that we're adapting and the culture has changed and that kind of thing. Law was a lot less about if X, then do Y every time, but rather that would be what's called a practical authority. Rather, I think that we're dealing with epistemic authorities. That is, how do we think about a specific situation? When it comes to ritual law, I'm not quite as sure that that's the case, but I think it is the case with a lot of like the civic laws. Okay, but then let's talk about this kind of ritual law that is going on here as well, and that we do see that there's concessions being made. I am not the only one to claim this. So, for example, Patton, in just all the way back in 1996, says it is clear that the author of Ezekiel knew some legal corpus in pre-Israel. To be sure, these laws resemble those in P, part of Leviticus, particularly the Holiness Code, more often than their counterparts in Deuteronomy or the Covenant Code. So he's saying there's a greater look towards the Holiness Code, this Levitical stuff. So what's going on in Deuteronomy then, or that's bothering Ezekiel? So Hahn and Bergsma argue that Ezekiel is referring to Deuteronomy's allowance that non-firstlings may be slaughtered in a secular context. Against priestly traditions that require all animal slaughter to take place in a sacred context. Thus, from a holiness priestly perspective, the Deuteronomic Code represents statutes that were not good in that they required only firstborn animals to be sacrificed, but not others. And I've given you Durrell, who is summing up Hahn and Bergsma's argument. Durrell would not agree with their argument. I'm just giving you from the other side, summing up Hahn and Bergsma. I think this is what's going on. So what am I saying? I'm saying that Deuteronomy has laws that break the regulations in Leviticus. In that, in Leviticus, you want to take all of your animals you slaughter, their blood needs to be brought to the tabernacle. Blood is holy, blood is sacred. But in Deuteronomy, it's just the firstborns. Just the firstborns need their blood brought, or the firstborns need to be brought to the temple, the centralized temple. Whereas other animals that you slaughter for eating, for meat, the blood can be just poured out on the ground. According to Leviticus, that's shocking. That's stunning. That would stun Israelites, so to speak. That Deuteronomic concession, that way of saying, well, we don't have to do it the way that Leviticus said. That's a big deal. So let's take a look at these texts. And I promise we're getting towards the end here of this section. So here's a comparison. So here's Leviticus 17, 2-6. This is the word that Yahweh commanded, saying, any man from the house of Israel who slaughters an ox or a sheep or a goat in the camp, or who slaughters it outside of the camp, and he does not bring it to the tent of assembly's entrance to present an offering to Yahweh before Yahweh's tabernacle, then that man shall be accounted blood guilty. He has poured out blood, and that man shall be cut off from the midst of his people. Big deal. So this is that the Israelites may bring their sacrifices that they are sacrificing in the open field and bring them for Yahweh to the tent of assembly's entrance to the priest, and they shall sacrifice fellowship offerings for Yahweh with them, and the priest shall sprinkle the blood on Yahweh's altar at the tent of assembly's entrance. That's what I just said. Bring all your animals to the tabernacle. The blood is sacred. Pour it out elsewhere, you're out. What does Deuteronomy say? But whenever you desire, you may slaughter, and you may eat meat according to the blessing of Yahweh your God that he has given to you in all your towns. The unclean and the clean may eat it just as they would the gazelle and as the deer. Only the blood you must not eat, but on the ground you must pour it like water. Notice the difference there. Any animal that's not this firstborn, pour on the ground like water. The sacred blood has been defiled. You are not allowed to eat in your towns the tithe of your grain and your wine and your olive oil and the firstborn I should have put this in bold, of your herd and your flocks and all of your votive gifts that you vowed and your freewill offerings and your donations. But only before Yahweh your God you shall eat it, in a place that Yahweh your God will choose. Do you see the difference? Only firstborns come to the temple to be performed in sacrificial rite. That's a big change from Leviticus, and it relates to firstborns. Do you see the connection with Ezekiel now? Do you see what's going on? This is really important. Notice in Leviticus, it goes as far as to say that not doing this means you to be cut off from the people. Deuteronomy is presenting a shocking law. It truly is shocking when it comes to the firstborns. Is it possible that this is what Ezekiel is referring to? I think it is. I think this makes a ton of sense, especially since the narrative has set you up that we're referring to the plains of Moab and the giving of the Deuteronomic laws, the Hukim and the Mishpatim of Deuteronomy. Okay, I'm going to read you just a little bit here from Honnenberg's because I think it's really important. And then we're pretty much going to move from this and move to the Exodus text pretty quick here. So they say the Deuteronomic Code introduces 3 changes to the regulations governing firstlings. The first is the allowance of profane slaughter, whereas under the, let's say, Levitical legislation, the people were required to visit the sanctuary or sanctuaries for the slaughter of any and all animals, Leviticus 17, 1-8. The Deuteronomic Code required the sanctuary visit only for the annual slaughter of the firstlings, Deuteronomy 12, 6, 17, 15, 19, 20, and voluntary sacrifices. Therefore, the annual sanctuary pilgrimage to offer tithes and sacrifice firstlings became a, if not the, distinctive practice of the Deuteronomic legislation when it was instituted, replacing the more frequent visitation of the sanctuary or sanctuaries mandated beforehand. And now this is them citing Weinfeld. Whereas before the reform of Deuteronomy, all slaughter, except that of game animals, was deemed to be a sacral act and was prohibited even for non-sacrificial purposes unless the blood was sprinkled upon the altar. I already told you this. It was now permissible to perform non-sacrificial slaughter without being obliged to sprinkle blood upon the altar. It need hardly be said that the sanctioning of profane slaughter freed a significant aspect of Israelite daily life from its ties to the cultus. The more crucial import of the law, however, is that by sanctioning non-sacrificial slaughter, it repudiates the hallowed Israelite dogma which ascribed a sacral quality to the blood and prohibited one from pouring it upon the ground. According to the priestly document, or to be more precise, the Holiness Code, Leviticus, the blood of slaughtered animals potentially valid for sacrifice must be sprinkled upon the altar. For all spilled blood, even of fowl and beasts of prey, cries out for vengeance and satisfaction. The author of Deuteronomy, on the other hand, declares that the blood of all animals slaughtered for non-sacrificial purposes may be poured out upon the ground like water, thereby asserting that blood has no more sacral value than water. You see what's going on then? I think this is what's happening. You'll even see the same idea of blood being sacral, and how Ezekiel refers to Leviticus rather than Deuteronomy in this metaphor here in chapter 24 just coming up. The blood was in the midst of her. She put it on a bare rock, did not pour it out on the ground to cover it with dust, to stir up rage, to avenge myself through vengeance. I placed its blood on the bareness of a rock so that it may not be covered. So this idea that you should cover it up, but didn't, just left it out in the open. The same thing is going. He's referring to this idea of the sacral value of blood according to Leviticus. Okay, we've come a long way. I think that this makes sense. Han and Bergsma also make an argument about, sorry, one sec here, about the redeeming objects as well, and how you can now redeem certain objects and bring them to the sanctuary sacrifices, where they would make the argument that would be contrary to what we see in Leviticus 27. Just for the sake of time, I'm not going to get into that. If you want to look at that, that's page 213 to 215 in their article. I find it interesting that when you get past these verses in Ezekiel, chapter 20, when you get to verses 27 to 31, it focuses on how their offerings in the land failed. That is, with the new regulations, the Deuteronomic regulations, they took it and ran with it, right? They were offering at the high places, their non-firstling offerings. You see that in verses 27 to 31. I won't get too much into that right now, but you can feel free to read that if you want. I think, again, it's the logic and the narrative behind this is that they now have the ability to eat this meat, and yet what do they do with this ability to have these animals and eat them not at the temple? They went to the high places, and that makes sense why the text continues in verses 27 to 31 in that way. So here's the conclusion from Han and Bergsma, that several provisions of the Deuteronomic Code would be perceived from a priestly perspective as violations of a higher standard of holiness. This applies specifically to the Deuteronomic provisions for limiting sacrificial slaughter to firstlings and voluntary offerings, and allowing the redemption of firstlings and the purchase of substitutes for sacrifice at the central sanctuary, which would be illicit and offensive according to the Holiness Code. Does it make sense now why this is not about sacrificing firstborn children? It's about sacrificing firstborn animals, and how that practice of just bringing the firstborn to the temple, that is a lower level of holiness than what you see in the book of Leviticus. A little complex, I know, but we're dealing with law here. We're dealing with halakhic concerns. A lot of sometimes it gets complex. I already pointed you to this. These following verses. I think I did want to say something briefly here. Yeah, so this is a verse that comes later in verse 31, and it says, when you lift up your gifts, and then depending if you're reading the Masoretic text, like the Hebrew text we generally use, or if you read the Septuagint, which actually omits the line you see there. So there is a reference back to verse 25 and 26, but I think that, and then you might make the claim, oh, it's referring to sacrificing children in verse 31, so it must be referring to sacrificing children in verse 25, 26. I don't think that's the case. I think the Septuagint is giving us an earlier reading where this idea of sacrificing children is not there. And moreover, I think that I don't think you need to equate the two. Even if you included the Hebrew text here, which I've omitted with the strike through, like it doesn't necessitate that the gifts are the same thing. You could have one case like, hey, the firstborn, like that defiled you, like in these gifts that you were giving. And like even more so, you ended up defiling yourselves even further with the gifts of your children. You took it and ran with it. Like I said, you went up to the high hills, and you weren't just slaughtering animals; you were slaughtering your children, and you defiled yourself par excellence. Defiled yourself. defilement par excellence kind of thing. That's possible, but again, I don't think that verse is actually, or that section of verse 31 is original to the text, just in case you're wondering. All right, this has been a really long video. I actually had a whole section on kind of rebuttals. I don't know if I'm going to go into that at length. Maybe I'll just briefly touch on it. So we see here that there's a term for sacrificing in Ezekiel verse 26. Beha'abir, this causing when to pass over, to transfer every firstborn of the womb, called pater racham. Some people think that's like a technical term for child sacrifice. I don't think that's the case. I'm not going to go into all the details now. It's not, as far as I can tell, the term. You do find it as well in Exodus. You find it in Exodus 13:12. I know some people would say, "Oh, that text is later," or whatever. There's no consensus on whether Ezekiel's using that text or that text is using Ezekiel. It's besides the point here. Exodus 13:12 uses this term with the redemption of firstborn, and with the giving of the firstborn. And if Ezekiel's talking about giving of firstborn animals, I think that you could definitely draw a parallel between the two texts. There's this is a redemption clause that you find in Exodus 13, where the firstborn child is not to be sacrificed, but rather it's going to be redeemed. And so there's different ways. There's like a vicarious sacrifice that's going on with the lamb then. And so instead they'll be redeemed either in the service of the Levites or by monetary payment to the temple, as we see in Numbers. And then you've also got the firstborn males that the entire tribe of Levi is going to represent as well. So there is clearly a distinction in Exodus in this passage. And I think that we see lots of other terms for sacrifice in the Hebrew Bible. Like I was saying, we've got saraf, to burn, natan, to give, the hifil here of avar. We've got zavach. We've got just a whole bunch of different terms, and these are terms that could be used for sacrifice or for child sacrifice. And I think even in Ezekiel, where is it? Do I have it here? Yeah, even in 16:20 to 21, he uses different terms for child sacrifice in parallel with each other, like savach, shachat, hifil, avar, like right here. And like these other terms, zavach, shachat, they can also just refer to sacrifice, like not of children. And so I don't think you can strongly make the claim here this is some sort of technical term for child sacrifice. It's just a term for sacrifice, in my opinion. Okay. I've just dealt with that there. There is, just so that everyone knows, a rebuttal against Hannah Bergsma's article. It took 20 years. Very surprising to me that no one really engaged with this for 20 years. It's mentioned in literature in a lot of these other resources, especially the ones who do agree with the child sacrifice interpretation, but they don't engage the argument. That bothers me, to be honest. But Jason Gill and Ezekiel and the World of Deuteronomy from 2021, pages 130 to 133, he is a first full attempt to combat Hannah Bergsma's thesis. I'm not going to get into everything in that. I've already dealt with some of it and what I've said, but I'm just letting you know that that does exist. This argument does exist. And that they kind of, or Gill goes with the translation and understanding from Freeble from his 2005 article. Just really quickly, I'm just going to quickly spitball this. Gill basically argues that, oh wait, why would Ezekiel have a problem with Deuteronomy when he cites Deuteronomy elsewhere in the book positively? He doesn't critique Deuteronomy that much. And does not Ezekiel understand that when the people became bigger, that obviously you're going to have to change things? Why would that be not good? And that even in Deuteronomy, it says, when Yahweh your God enlarges your territory as he has promised you, and you say, I'm going to eat some meat, If the place where Yahweh your God will choose to put his name is too far from you, then you may slaughter. So it's like it's did Ezekiel not understand that obviously they're going to need to do this kind of thing? I think he's missing the point there. I think the point in Deuteronomy, you can actually see in the language itself that he's talking about a concession. When he enlarges your territory, if the place is too far, it's not saying go ahead and do whatever you want. It's saying if it's too far, like, oh, fine, okay. If it's too far, then. And so I think if you read Deuteronomy, it is a concession. It's quite clearly a concession. And Ezekiel is picking up on that. I think Ezekiel has an idealistic view in mind. And he sees that you should actually still bring it to the temple in Deuteronomy, but if you're too far, then you don't have to do that. Also, there's a huge difference in the sacral value of blood that we've already pointed out. A lower standard of holiness in that regard. And they don't, Jill doesn't really focus that much on that, and I think is missing that point there of what Hannenberg and myself are trying to point out. Yeah, so it's a concession. Ezekiel recognizes that, doesn't call it evil, just calls it not good. Still authorized by God, according to Ezekiel. He's not condemning Deuteronomy. He thinks it's from God. He's just saying it's not as good as what we find in Leviticus. Here, I've given you on the screen, this is Freeble's translation that Jill goes with. I've seen this one online as well, whereas they understand the decrees in verse 25 and 26 here to be like decrees about God saying, I'm going to disperse you and scatter you, according to the previous verses, and that judgments, punishment by which they would not have life, and then does continue with like the idea of the child sacrifice, but being rather that he declared them defiled. He didn't defile them. He declared them defiled on account of their gifts to their idols, on account of their offering by fire all their firstborn. I don't find this one particularly compelling because it changes the function of the hukim and the mishpatim, because we've already seen that that's like a rhetorical thing Ezekiel's doing, and so we know that the sense should be the same sense as that we see in Deuteronomy, the hukim and the mishpatim. It's the literal laws. We're talking about the laws. And then earlier on, when it says the ancestors had hukim and mishpatim, it's clearly referring to laws. They're just a downgrade. They're not as good as Leviticus. And so I think that's what's going on as well. And so to change the sense between, I don't like that. That's typically not good in communication. You'd have to really signal that somehow else in a different way, I should say. That doesn't seem to be going on. I think Ezekiel's setting you up for the interpretation that I've said, the Deuteronomic one. So I don't like Freeble's argument. Some of you, if you're still listening, thank you to this. Good. Some of you have skipped ahead to Exodus, which we are going to get to right now. So I'm not a big fan of that interpretation. We're going to hop to Exodus now. Finally, right, Joel? An hour and 18 minutes in. I want it to be rather concise. And if you think that's concise, you might say, well, that's not concise at all, Joel. But so I want it to be concise, but also to work through the argument as it presents itself, so that this could just be a reference point for you going forward. This kind of stuff involves some complex argumentation, so I've actually skipped many things that I have in notes, but I've just given you this because you do need to walk through the whole thing. Hopefully it's made sense. That is just, again, before we move to Exodus, Ezekiel is referring to Deuteronomy, and the firstborn are firstborn sacrifices that Deuteronomy introduces, whereas you don't have to bring other slaughtered animals to the temple. You can just pour their blood out. That's a lower standard of holiness, according to Ezekiel, who loves priestly stuff, Levitical stuff, and so it's a problem. It shocked them, these laws of Deuteronomy. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Okay, we're going to move quickly. This one will be much quicker, to Exodus 22, 28, and 29, or 29 on the Septuagint. All right. I would point out that there are other commentators who don't agree with the child sacrifice interpretation in Ezekiel 20, but I'll move on from that. All right, we are moving to Exodus. This is a really interesting verse. So let's read it quick here. You will not delay the fullness of your harvest and the juice from your press. You will give me the firstborn of your sons. You will do likewise in this manner for your ox and for your sheep and goats. 7 days it will be with its mother. On the 8th you will give it to me. Yeah, so what's going on? Why, I already mentioned way earlier, why this is taken to mean child sacrifice. You've got this parallel of giving. You'll give me the firstborn of your sons. You will give to me on the 8th day these animals in sacrifice. So then are we giving the sons in sacrifice as well? And then I often see a lot read into this, you will do likewise in the same manner, in this manner. So if it's true that you're giving your animal as a sacrifice, that must mean on the 8th day, it must mean that you're giving your firstborn son on the 8th day in sacrifice. I don't think this makes sense. Here's why. So let's walk into it. Before I do, I want to point out that there are plenty of commentators, critical commentators on Exodus, who disagree with the child sacrifice interpretation of this. One of the standards is Hootman. It's from the 90s, but Hootman, Volume 2, page 166. He thinks that the idea of dedication and how that was done, it leaves it open. You've got Prop, who's another excellent critical commentary on Exodus. He thinks that it could indicate setting apart, this idea of giving. But again, there's the idea of the 8th day. It's like, well, how do you set them apart? Like on the 8th day, maybe circumcision or something like that. But if it's going to be with its mother and then not with its mother on the 8th day, doesn't that imply that it's going to die, right? You can't have a baby without its mother. It needs its milk. Those are old commentaries. So you might say to me, Joel, you can't rely on old critical commentaries. Okay, I won't. So the most recent, most critical, highest standard critical commentary on Exodus that exists. This is Davies. He's not going to be holding like inerrancy presuppositions with the Bible like that. He's going to be all over the place when it comes to source criticism. This is the standard critical commentary as we currently sit here in the year 2024. He says Exodus 22, 28, 29 has nothing to say about any animal except cattle, sheep, and goats, which could not be redeemed, and it is hardly likely that it envisaged the actual sacrifice of human firstborn, even if some quote-unquote extremists understood it in this way. And by the extremists, he's actually referring to Ezekiel 20. He thinks that one refers to extremists who thought about child sacrifice. But he is saying Exodus 22, 28, and 29 don't refer to human sacrifice. And so that's the most recent critical commentary. Maybe he's changed his view. That came out in 2020. From what I understand, I have a friend who knows Graham, and I've reached out to him a few times through this friend. He's still working on the covenant code stuff. And so maybe he's changed opinion, but as it stands, that's the most recent critical commentary on Exodus. And he does not agree with that interpretation. So that's one thing. I want to talk about the verse now. I think part of the problem is that you'll see people say, oh, verse 30 here. It says, actually, that should be it should say verse 29, shouldn't it? Yeah. It'd be verse 30 in the Septuagint. So please do excuse that. So you will do likewise. You'll do in the same manner for your ox, sheep, goat, 7 days with its mother. On the 8th, you'll give it to me. I hear people say, oh, well, you have to do the same thing that verse 29 states to the sons. Everything that verse 29 says about the sons, and here again it's verse 30. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Everything that verse says, you got to read that back into what you do for the sons. I think that's mistaken. It is putting too much weight on this. I have it in bold here, the likewise or the in this manner. It's as though that interpretation draws an equal sign between the two. that whatever is equal for the first one is equal for the second, whatever is for the second is for the first. That's not how that demonstrative adverb works. It's a grammatical category. The term is kain. It starts off verse 29. Kain taseh l'shorecha l'tzonecha shivat yamin yehya imimo vayom hashemini titano li. That's so. Thus you will do. What does the thus mean? What does that indicate in the Hebrew language? And I think that there's actually some people often are missing what that does, what this demonstrative adjective does, can or cannot do. So kain, again, meaning likewise in this manner, it points backwards. It doesn't point forwards. So follow me here. I know we're long into this video, but follow me with some Hebrew grammar. Kain, I'm citing Hootman now, is a particle with a referring function. It refers to something already known to the reader. So when it says in this manner, it points back to information you already have. Similarly, I'll cite Juan and Moroka in their Hebrew grammar. There are two different kinds of demonstrative adverbs, I should say. So you've got the A type and you've got a B type. The B type is the one we're looking at here, kain, and it means in this fashion, thus in this fashion, and it's retrospective, as in it's looking back on information. This is what Hootman just said. Why is this important? Follow with me. When we read Exodus 22:29, or verse 30, which I have labeled in English here as, when it says thus or in this manner, it is not drawing an equal sign between the two verses. Rather, 22:29 is presupposing information that has already been given. This is really important. What is the previous information? One way to look at it would be this. The previous information is this idea, this concept of giving your first fruits. That's one way of thinking about it. And so then when it says to do likewise in this manner, it's you will do likewise in giving first fruits for your ox and your sheep and your goats. That's the previous information you read. You do not then read 7 days it will be with its mother, on the 8th you will give it to me, as being the previous. It's not previous information that we have, so it's actually new information. So that you can't bring that and bring it back into the previous verse. That's not how kain works. That's not how the in this manner works. That's new information. And we'll get to that more of that in a second here. So that's one way. If the previous verse is about first fruits, delay of the fullness of your harvest and the juice from your press, that's the idea of giving from harvest and juice from grapes or what have you. There's ways you can translate that verse, but I've just given you this. And then you'll give me the firstborn of your son. Both of those have to do with the concept of first fruits. So you will do likewise in the concept of first fruits for your ox and your sheep and your goats. That's one way we can think about this. You could also make it a little more specific, that the previous information is to give firstborn first fruits. So you will do likewise in that you will also give firstborn first fruits for your, and note this, see what I have here. What doesn't verse 22:29 state? It tells you nothing about the firstborn or male status of the ox, the sheep, and the goats. That information is supplied from the previous verse. The likewise is giving you that information. It's saying you will do in the same manner. And so then you can then infer when it says for your ox, oh, it's for your firstborn male ox. And sheep, it's for your firstborn male sheep. For goats, firstborn male goats. That information is not in the verse, but you have to infer it from the previous verse. And that's the function of kain here. The likewise, the in this manner. That's what it's doing, potentially. So what is already known to the reader is either general first fruit offerings or giving your firstborn as a first fruit offering. In either case, you shouldn't read what is prescribed for the animals back into what is being prescribed for the sons. So that's the 7 days thing. I don't think that's how the particle works. And just so you know, I went through most, just for my own sake, I went through most of the uses of this in the Hebrew Bible. There's like 500 or 600 or something. I didn't get through all of them. I didn't think I needed to, but this really, like what I'm saying about this part, this demonstrative adverb here, I think that this is pretty clear that this is how this functions. I'm sure someone could make a case otherwise, but generally, or for some like some odd case or something, but generally speaking, this is how this functions, and that's what the grammars say. So I already said that. Note that 2229 doesn't specify anything about the firstborn status of the animals. This information that the reader already knows is what's being carried over with the thus. It's not an equal sign. It's carrying over this previous information. One way you could look at it is this. That it's problematic to make a comparison work backwards from a larger concept to a more specific concept. So like A is like B does not mean that B is the same as A. So here's an example. If I say, you are going to do a new fitness regime, you shall do cardio, you shall lift weights. In this fashion, you shall eat vegetables. You shall eat them for 5 days straight. The in this fashion refers to the concept of what? The fitness regime. You can't say eating vegetables for 5 days has anything to do with lifting weights because the comparison was with the broader concept. So that's it. If we understand it that way, then that in this first one I have here on the slide, then that's all it's doing is saying in the same way as first fruits offerings, you're going to do this. And so the further information of the 7 days with his mother, 8th day, that doesn't actually get brought backwards. That's a new instruction of something going forward. So it's a specific procedure that's attached. Their own specific procedure gets attached to the second half of verse 29. You don't want to read it back in just because A, this more specific idea, is like B, the broader idea. It does not mean that B is like A in all the same ways, is what I'm trying to say. Or if in the second interpretation here we go, maybe you think the thus is referring back to firstborn males, you've still got a similar problem. The information being brought from verse 28 is clearly inferred. There's no mention, like I said, of firstborn males in verse 29. That information comes from verse 28. And you're supposed to bring that information to verse 29, and it comes from the thus, the Cain, in this manner. So don't read the procedure about taking the animal from its mother back into verse 28. That's not how the particle works. Taking the animal from its mother is new information, not prior information. So if you want to make the claim that the 7 days with the mother on the 8th day it's removed from the mother, that applies to firstborn male children, you need to make that case on other grounds. You could make that case. The procedure from its take its mother applies to firstborn male children, but it appears to me that is not established by the particle Cain. You need to make a different case for it based on assumptions the writer, their cultural context, or based on the fact the verses have similar content. But that still doesn't necessitate it. Instead, I think what these verses convey are various different first fruit offerings. Hopefully that's making sense to you. Now I can already hear someone typing in the comments. Oh, but you might argue these verses, or they might say, both of them say give. You got to give on your firstborn animal, and you got to give your firstborn son. So it's the same. It's drawing a parallel, and the same procedures must be in view. I don't think this works. We need to consider implicit information in our communication acts. So what do I mean by that? Okay, pretend you're a farmer, and I'm a farmer. Now I come to you and I say, next week I will give you 2 vats of wine, 2 hay bales. I will give you my 2 sons. I will give you 2 sheep and 2 cows. What do I mean by give on each of these occasions? They're not the same thing, right? Like, am I actually going to give, am I giving my 2 sons, like, if I'm giving my 2 sheep and cows, let's say for slaughter, does that necessitate that I'm giving my 2 sons for slaughter? No. There's implicit information. There are prior frameworks that are active here, and on which you could assume that there's different concepts of giving. I think it's a completely fair assumption that the original readers would hear give and supply implicit information regarding each of the first fruit offerings. We know from ancient Near Eastern texts and culture more broadly that people were given as first fruit offerings, but that didn't mean they were killed. I've recently been doing some research on this for my commentary on Exodus and the Septuagint, and I was just noticing humans are given as first fruit offerings, but it's just a dedication to a temple. And so I think, based on this being an ancient Near Eastern practice, which is pretty well attested across the board, that the idea of giving a first fruit child and giving a human and a first fruit animal can be conceptualized differently. And that would not necessarily be uncommon practice in the ancient Near East. I think I have for you one last slide, because why not? I've cited myself in an unpublished work. This is what's coming out. And so I think the Septuagint actually also lends towards a different conception of giving in both. Now, you could say Septuagint's late, they didn't understand the earlier child sacrifice thing, sure, but they're also someone skilled in reading Hebrew and understanding the verses, and so I think that they actually might have something, this translator might have something to say here. So G, the translator, appears to conceptualize the giving in each verse differently. Natan, to give, is translated with the lexeme, the word didomi in this verse, but with apodidomi in the following verse. Apodidomi in the active voice means to return. And so the animals are returned to Yahweh in sacrifice. Presumably, G, the translator, did not see the same kind of giving when rendering with didomi in verse 22-28. So he uses different terms for the idea of giving. Perhaps he conceptualized it more as a more metaphorical transaction, though it is always possible that didomi and apodidomi represent stylistic variation. However, G appears to be quite intentional in the terms he deploys in this legal section. It is possible that G also connected the prototaka to the aparchas. Humans can be first offerings, that is, they're dedicated to cultic service. So I think this makes more sense of this verse. Not only are critical commentators in disagreement with the child sacrifice verse, even recent ones, not all, but recent ones like Davies. Not only should we not read an equal sign when it comes to the in this manner, the Cain, but also I think it's fair to say that the give can be conceptualized differently. And and so ultimately we shouldn't read this. I don't think we should read the 7 days with its mother and 8th day as being given as necessitating a sacrifice or something like that. Perhaps you can make a case for circumcision, that on the 8th day it's given, dedicated in circumcision, the child is. But even still, like I said earlier, you can't read all that procedure of the 7th day on the 8th day back in as though drawing an equal sign between those verses, because as far as I can tell, that's not how Cain works in Hebrew. And we see the information being supplied, which is the firstborn male status, which is what's carried over into the next verse. Hopefully that made sense to you. This was, I recognize, a pretty big deep dive. Maybe you followed along, maybe you haven't. Maybe you've been wondering about these verses and you just didn't know what to do with them. I have tried to give you the way that I understand this. I understand there's different ways of looking at things. There are lots of different interpretations. That's fine. I'm trying to think to look at all the data and come up with the best answer that I can, and trying to challenge my own assumptions for sure. But at the same time, going, what does this text say, and is it maybe not what I've often seen some people say and others say online or conferences or the like. Yeah, so maybe you agree, you disagree, maybe you've never heard this before, maybe you don't care, maybe you're going, what is this going on here? That's fine. I'm happy that you stuck with me this whole time, and if you got to hear, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And next time we'll focus on a different aspect of the biblical text in its ancient context. And I'm grateful for you to have come with me this far. So thank you. Have a great day.